The failed parasitic super soldier, the Garador anatomy in Resident Evil 4 Remake explained.
As the ability of the Lost Plagas was not fully known concerning how it could impact the human meat suit, the only logical conclusion to any future with this parasite and its gene editing abilities was to begin to run experimentations on villagers and travelers that just happened by.
I want to note he started 2 videos off with that same exact shot. To be fair, it is one of the most iconic Lost Plagas shots in the game, both remake and in original.
Beginning, the people who were just infected by breathing in the long dormant parasitic spores would be controlled by a more dominant strain of Lost Plagas, but their usefulness was very limited. Possessing really only the beneficial trait of being controlled, they would conduct minor attacks on others, but with any amount of training or ability to counter these attacks, it was really only about as useful as a regular civilian attacking one another.
Right.
And even to that point, the movement was sluggish, their bodies were not as conducive to military missions, and ultimately, this would just highlight the potential this parasite had concerning mind control, but little else. As Sadler, the biggest nerd imaginable, would hire on researchers to further the study of this parasite, his goals would begin to shift, as it always tends to do, towards world domination. By understanding this parasite and that it had the ability to control anyone that it came into contact with, thus allowing him to control the person who was infected, the plan began to center around the idea of mind-altering the world leaders, and more specifically, the President of the United States. Because let's be real here, if you control the United States, you control the world. USA, baby.
America, just don't touch our boats, okay? Don't touch the boats. You don't touch the boats, you're probably going to be fine. The moment you touch the boats, though, like eyes glow red, neuron activation.
By hiring Krauser to retrieve Ashley, the president's daughter, she would be infected with the parasite, as the plan was to have her rescued and then returned to her father, where she would go on to infect him, thus completing a large portion of their overall, vision board, resulting in the other world leaders being infected over time and the eventual collapse of society under one ruler, which would be Sadler. Of course, what Sadler couldn't grasp is that the mind-altering parasite that could inspire horrific anatomical changes, you don't really control something like that. You get controlled by something like that. And because of this, his goal would go from just a generalized outline to a full-blown religion, as it tends to do with humanity. To thwart this, well, really just to save Ashley, as he ultimately ended up thwarting the end of the world, Leon would be dispatched, stumbling across experimentations and slightly unethical testing that was taking place in this backwater village in Spain.
Only slightly unethical. Slightly. However, technically, ethics aside, is it a war crime the first time? I mean, the answer is no, it's not a war crime the first time. Would testing on people, the Lost Plagas like that, would that be considered a war crime? If not, it's after Resident Evil 4, it gets written in the Geneva Convention. Nice.
As he would traverse the area, his mission would change from just rescuing Ashley, because really, at any point after finding Ashley, he could have just walked off into the woods with her and then kind of just kept walking. It became increasingly obvious it would be imperative that they would need to remove the parasite from their bodies, otherwise Sadler's plan would come to fruition. After moving into the castle, the extent of this parasitic experimentation would be laid bare. Deep within the basement, like an absolute NEET, would be a creature known as the Garador, or Garrador, whatever. Blinded, angry, and having not showered in many months, he would be your average Reddit mod with the same personality to boot. But what exactly were the structural changes to the body, and how are they achieved through hormonal alterations? Let's discuss that in today's episode over the Garador, which apparently is how you pronounce it. But first, this episode is sponsored by Incogni. Did you know your data on the internet is probably pretty much everywhere right now, and it's currently being bought and sold for somebody else's personal gain? You know that guy that always calls you at like 6:49 p.m. right when you sat down for dinner, offering you nonsense that you don't need? Yeah, that's because they bought your information from somewhere else when your personal info was leaked. Classic. Things like your full name, your email address, home address, gender, phone number, relatives, social security number, all of that. Well, if you're ready to put a stop to that, then by using today's sponsor, because you do have the right to request your personal data be deleted from their servers, you can stop all of these annoyances. Do it alone would probably take months or years to track them down, but by heading to incogni.com/Roanoke and using code Roanoke, you can get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan. You might not think it's already happened to you. It has. For real, let's say that you subscribed to like a newsletter, or you were looking up some medical cases like I do. You start seeing ads and promotions because of that medical case, or you start receiving a lot of spam from unknown senders because of the newsletter. That's your cue to get your data taken off of their servers. Incogni works to do this, and they send you updated reports on their progress as they pull your information from data brokers. So again, if that sounds like that's going to be a good thing for you, then going to incogni.com/Roanoke and using code Roanoke, you can get an exclusive 60% off an annual Incogni plan, or you can just click the link below. All right, let's get back to it.
So I like that there are options, right? Incogni, there are other options to reach out to these data brokers. I feel that it's a solution to a problem that should never exist in the first place. In my brain, intrusive thought of the day. So you know how there was that whole thing where you're bogging down the USPS with potatoes? Apparently you just slap like postage on a potato, like just and potato, and it was just a whole thing a few months ago as of this video, right? What if you find out a data broker like has your information, right? And you know who it is. You request your information, but at the same time, you also sign them up for every magazine in the book. You sign them up for everything else. You leak their information to other data brokers. Is that legal or is that illegal? See, the thing with Kip is, I love it. I'm here. Sometimes I get upset over a certain thing, whatever, right? When you start being really scummy, I start to identify as a problem. And thus my intrusive thoughts will lead me to, man, would be a real damn shame just to have, 50,000 potatoes just show up at your house, right? Maybe you shouldn't be a data broker. Oh, God. I love it.
Getting into the castle, you need to understand what this area's original purpose was for. Initially, for generations that came after, this castle was built as a fortress in order to contain Las Plagas from escaping. Relegated to the passages below the castle, the first plan was to corrupt the nobility of this castle. Being one of the more weaker parts of the bloodline that the family had really ever had or existed within this area, Ramon Salazar would be easily swayed by Sadler, ultimately convincing him to allow the revival of the Las Plagas under his command, as he was promised power for it. Completely forsaking his family's mission that they had conducted for hundreds of years, a mining operation would bring back Las Plagas, but it was desiccated and not able to be revived in its multicellular form. Because of this, it would at first appear like this was a lost cause. By opening up the passageways, though, into the caves and sending in villagers, by natural interaction, oxygen levels would need to be raised in the environment, and movement would eventually stir up a spore form of Las Plagas. As these spores entered through the nasal passages, moving into the trachea and then settling in the alveolar sacs of the lungs, it would appear that unfortunately the human innate immune system could do very little to prevent this infection, which
It's interesting because Las Plagas is, for all intents and purposes, a parasite, and the body is kind of hit or miss when it comes to parasites. Like, absolutely, we have, scientists, specialists, fields. Their entire thing is epidemic, pandemic prevention, etc., right? Studying virology, studying bacteria, studying parasites, even prions. That's the weird one, right? What are the vectors of disease, right? You got parasites, viruses, bacteria, but what about, what is it, mad cow disease, right? And other prions are also a thing that can cause disease, and I think that it's one of those things, like, especially me going through school, right? Makes sense why we don't mention prions, especially because, as far as I'm aware, the science behind them, we just kind of know they exist and they do things, but not necessarily the peculiars. Prions, that's an interesting rabbit hole. Especially because how delayed the thing can be, right? You can, access to said stimuli, and it either has a immediate effect or it has a delayed effect. So what I understand, the whole Eat Beef campaign that happened in over in Europe, right? I think it was the UK specific. What was it? It was England specifically, right? The whole Eat Beef thing, I think it was in the 80s or 90s. And a bunch of people had, effects that happened then, but it's kind of a ticking time bomb from then over the next 20, 30 years for other people. Prions is an entire rabbit hole. I am definitely underqualified to talk about it, but definitely something that I feel should be researched a little more and something that should be known a little more in terms of just hey, this is a cool thing that you should learn about. But yeah, no, Salazar is an interesting character, and I'm kind of mixed on him in the remake. So versus the original 4 versus the remake 4, there's a couple things that they changed. Krauser and Sadler effectively kind of get swapped. Krauser was hardly mentioned, kind of shows up for the knife fight and his final fight, right? Shows up in separate ways in Operation Ada, I believe, right? And then we have Sadler, who effectively, is the character throughout, right? And he's super villain status, right? I love him. He's so cliche. And the whole of original Resident Evil 4 alludes to this whole campiness and it's cliche in your Hollywood movies, Mr. Kennedy, right? And so in the remake, Sadler and Krauser kind of got swapped though. Krauser is kind of the one that you kind of follow throughout and you see more of, where Sadler, you have very little interaction directly with him, and it's actually very interesting. But Salazar, I didn't like him at first in the remake, but he grew on me. He is definitely different from Bro, thank you for the sub and the follow. He's definitely different from the original. but the way that they wrote him and how just sadistic and just unhinged he is leads him into just this different character that actually grew on me as someone that's like, man, I kind of want to pity this dude, but he's also just kind of like actually awful. Yeah, fun things.
Fact. Did you know that you had white blood cells patrolling your lungs at all times? Every day, we take in thousands of spores, actually between 1 and 10 per breath. Because of the natural environment of your lungs being warm, moist, and dark, this is the perfect breeding ground for mold spores. However, white blood cells are constantly moving around in your lungs, searching for these foreign bodies and engulfing them. Without our immune system, we would meet our ends by suffocation, as the mold would quickly grow wildly out of control, choking us out. Absolutely insane to think how our immune system not only just handles this, but it does so effectively our entire lives without like failing ever, unless you catch like HIV, in which case, yeah, then it kind of fails.
Yeah, and that's the thing. That's where being, whether you get HIV, some other immunodeficiency, if you're immunocompromised, lung issues, respiratory issues are a huge thing.
Now back to the parasite. As the infection would begin, it became clear that the villagers who were mining would at first have an immune response like anyone else. Their white blood cells were not able though to engulf and destroy the parasite like it would with the mold, likely due to the fact that the parasite was bigger and also had a tougher exterior armoring that is seen in the multicellular version. Because of this, the parasite would grow and be thoroughly reborn, much to the delight of Sadler. One of the interesting things that can be seen throughout any infection form is seemingly the place of the parasite inspires massive changes downstream.
Actually, something that I have to think about, in both the original and the remake, don't we visit the caverns underneath the castle? So we visit where, in the original, we definitely visited where Las Plagas was being mined up. And so that begs the question, like, throughout the story, we have the one parasite, the one Las Plagas that we're dealing with, right? The one that's hatching, right? Is it possible for multiple? Because I'm assuming, like, oh, well, you can get a, singular brain-eating amoeba, but I'm sure you could get multiple. I mean, just because you have one parasite doesn't mean the multiple of the different parasites can't get in, right? So when you open up the spore form, the disease vector effectively being, in the air, right? It being airborne because spore form, it's really interesting to consider that they're just kind of walking biohazards. Like, imagine Leon and Ashley get back to the States, right? Sure, we blew up the island, but we didn't take care of, the castle. I'm sure a cleanup crew would have, maybe even the BSAA. Yeah, they were active at that time, right? Yeah. I don't remember. Was the Terra Grigia incident before or after 4? I think it was after 4, right? Someone's going to have to correct my Resident Evil lore on that one. But, like, they're effectively just walking biohazards. So they're walking around. They're going to get that. Like, they have to get quarantined, especially if there's any spore forms on there. It seems like the spore form, yes, has, like, this gestation period, has this growth period. But, like, anyone that comes into contact with them can pick up these spores. So that's interesting to consider, as well as if they inhaled spores, like, we didn't have more parasites growing, we didn't have more Las Plagas in us, but you could also write that off as it probably would have been an early enough stage that the radiation probably would have killed it off anyways. So, I don't know, I hadn't really thought about that plot point before. But I mean, when you start dealing with things like, what's the big one? Anthrax? How that thing can just live for, is it thousands of years dormant? Like people uncover stuff historically and like, oh, wow, that anthrax is still there. It's dormant, but yeah, it's still there, right? I really wanted to be someone that dealt with disease vectors. Just didn't have the grades to do that.
Standard Ganado, which is just your average person who was infected by the parasite, either by natural means of breathing it in or through human intervention, such as injecting the parasite into your neck. This parasite appears to settle into the chest cavity of a person near the heart and lungs. Knowing that the parasite is oxygen dependent, as when it was in the mines with lower levels of oxygen, left it almost extinct. This is an integral clue and an integral place for it to exist for its own survival. By placing itself near the heart and lungs, it would have access to the pulmonary vein specifically. By tapping into this area, it could fuse with its own siphon, so to speak, into the vein to retrieve oxygen-rich blood. Now remember, arteries go away from the heart and are usually oxygenated, and veins go towards the heart and are usually deoxygenated. But the interesting thing about the pulmonary vein is it's actually coming from the lungs towards the heart, so it's oxygenated, whereas the pulmonary artery is going towards the lungs because it's deoxygenated. Anywho, this may be why it also inspires such changes to others, which we will see soon. From here, the tendrils, which can completely destroy the cervical spine, as well as the skull, can come out at night in order to attack others. However,
so I guess that actually leads into further plot points where, what is it, the movie with Ada and Leon, and it's over in like Eastern Europe, I can't remember the name of it right now. I don't think it's not Damnation. It's the one where Ada is like, it's the B one, and the Las Plagas sample is there at the bartering table, and it's the teacher that can control the LICKERs. I can't say that word on YouTube because Roanoke got in trouble for that for some god awful reason. Like, so it opens up that Salazar Castle, and underneath Salazar Castle is still going to be a hot spot for grabbing base Plaga, and then you have the Plaga Type 2s, which we've seen in Resident Evil 5, but it wouldn't surprise me if, hey, we didn't really take care of this, or in the time since Resident Evil 4 ends to whenever a cleanup crew can get there to try and, you know, purge it in holy fire. I mean, there's a lot that it leaves open. So it's interesting that Las Plagas is still kind of this like force, but I think that, well, Resident Evil 7 and Village really went hard into the Megamycete, Mutamycete mold situation. That makes me wonder, one, I'm curious for Resident Evil 5 Remake, which I like Resident Evil 5. I had zero issue with Resident Evil 5. I understand why people don't like it. Roanoke as well, and I respect that they don't like it. It makes me curious for Resident Evil 5 Remake, but also where the franchise is going to go, not only from the film side of things, but in Resident Evil 9 as well. Are we going to see a resurgence of Las Plagas? It's entirely possible, especially with the lore drop in Resident Evil 4 Remake that Las Plagas, in some capacity, is infused with the T-Virus.
However, this is just the standard placement that does not appear to be really putting selective pressure on the parasite. In the experimentation process, it is seen quite readily that placement of the parasite and where it specifically bonds to is very important. Take El Gigante, and I pronounce it like that because it makes everyone upset.
Yeah.
The placement of the parasite would...
It's like how I said Lobstoberfest instead of Lobsterfest because I forgot. I said Lobstoberfest, and everybody's malding. And that's the thing, right? Don't feed the internet trolls. The inverse also works. Because I had so many people get upset at me, I just call it Lobstoberfest now. Legally distinct Lobsterfest. It's really not, right? You get what I'm saying?
Be just around the cervical area of the spine, which is the neck, and this had quite an impact on the size of the creature. Standing at just under the height of a barn, it would be basically putting this thing at around 20 to 25 feet tall, or 7 to 8 meters tall. Because of the location being specifically in the neck of this creature, it would appear to me oxygen through the carotid artery would be much more limited in terms of volume coming through. This would seemingly inspire changes in the body that we will actually see kind of in the Garador. But the question remains, why are these changes present? To understand that, we must first take a look at the Garador's physiology, as this will help to explain why perhaps these differences even exist in the first place. Ah shit, here we go again. Starting with the feet of the Garador, we see that it's actually just your average homegrown feet. Don't get too excited over there. However, we can see at the ankle, with the width that it is, even with boots on, it has increased, indicating that the growth all over the body is intentional and has happened through a steady release of hormones, which we will discuss when we get to the neurology.
Actually, it kind of reminds me of Mendez, right? Chief by Torres Mendez. How he is just a large man. I'm 90% sure that that's Plaga caused, right? So that's actually kind of similar.
Moving up to the legs, we see the muscle mass has also increased in this area, and an armor plating has been added to protect the front of the shins. The reasoning here is quite clear. As we all know, the Garador has been blinded, making it really easy for him to run into the corner of a coffee table and absolutely destroy his shins.
Yeah.
This is actually a pretty apropos solution to my own apparent inability to sense a freaking coffee table near me about 3 minutes ago. Moving up further the legs to the pelvic region, essentially this guy can squat. But interestingly, as we move up to the abdomen, we can begin to see what has happened to the body, indicating pronounced hypertrophy. There is evidence of wounding on some of the Garador's abdomens, but again, this is probably from their own claws, but the abdominal region has pronounced musculature, which will be the theme as we move up to the thoracic region. At one point, possessing clothing, the shirt has either been torn due to the armaments, or it has been basically just torn because it's gotten so big. But then when we get to the shoulders and arms, we can see swole goals is in full effect. I too am trying to get this muscular. The shoulders being the connection point to the body, obviously, where the arms, connect to the chest. But it has increased in connective tissue to allow for the Garador to swing around its large claws that it has, with the muscle stretching and tearing the skin, or at least the skin is just barely keeping up with the underlying growth. Moving down.
I mean, you have to think about it as somebody that wears steel plate, right? I mean, steel plate armor is heavy. So now imagine this dude has literal steel chain around his neck, right? We have what looks like, not a rebar rod, but we have really heavy gauntlets at this point. Really heavy gauntlets. Some of them, like the elite one you just saw, are wearing chainmail, and they're wearing, this giant pronounced helmet, right? Like, yeah, it's going to need the muscle mass to support all of that. You kind of get this weird effect of, like, escort the payload, right? As long as you can get the Garador to wherever you need it, grats, drop it in, it's going to clear that room.
On the arms, large metallic connective points have been attached to the arms, allowing for the hands to curl around an apparatus built specifically to create these massive claws that then can be powerfully swung, taking out anything near it.
Right.
Moving up to the head, we see a face only a mother could love at this point. It is unknown if the person has any hair left on their head, but it appears to be pretty standard after experimentations are conducted for everyone to lose their hair, which brings in this episode sponsored by Keeps. No, it's not sponsored by Keeps. But the mouth is covered up by bars to prevent biting, and the eyes have been sewn shut to prevent the Garador from actually seeing what it's attempting to attack. The helmet has been affixed and chained to the body to basically prevent it from removing it itself. Moving around the back of the creature, again, the latissimus muscles are absolutely massive, as well as the posterior deltoid area and trapezius muscle. But the most obvious point of focus is Las Plagas sprouting from its back. A slit sits just between the shoulders, indicating that this particular parasite was planted in the thoracic spine, not the cervical spine, which again is rather interesting as it highlights why this particular person didn't end up like a Ganado or an El Gigante.
Right.
Really, instead, it's just sort of like a median creature. I believe it has to do with oxygen and the ability to acquire nutrients. In those who have the parasite in their chest specifically, this allows for the parasite to acquire all the nutrients it needs and dominate the body really quickly. And those that have the parasite in their cervical area, there is less access to oxygen and nutrients. And because of this, the parasite is forced to take a larger proportion of the oxygen, which in turn leads to massive brain damage as less oxygen is getting to a human's brain meat, which renders El Gigante more animalistic as its frontal lobe has been deprived of oxygen as they fall back on instinctual behaviors rather than higher thought. However,
What doesn't that also line up with? Is it a lore entry or whatever? How there's just at least assumed that there's just a warehouse full of just like brain dead El Gigante somewhere, where like they're failed experiments and they just were cast aside and discarded. Wouldn't that line up with that plot point too?
with the Garador, it is the middle ground. Because the Garrador and the parasite is grafted into the thoracic area of the body, or at least on the back, the access to the oxygen would be greater than if it was just in the neck, but less than if it was right next to the pulmonary vein. As a result of this, it is forced to alter the host in several different ways in order to help sustain its own life, which the level of growth the body seems to support also seems to support this theory. The further away from central mass and the ability to get oxygen, the more prone the parasite is to altering the hormones of an animal that it is in, as well as it may even just straight exit the body in order to breathe. As the Garador has the parasite on its back, it would clearly be interfacing with the spinal cord and following it up to the brain with its tendrils in order to manipulate the organism. By entering through the area where the brainstem usually enters the skull, the foramen magnum, it would first come into contact with the lower areas of the brain. These areas contain critically sensitive structures that are used to coordinate several different autonomic functions of the body. What is an autonomic function, I can hear you asking?
Oh no. Am I about to like feel my tongue in my mouth? Am I about to like understand that I'm manually having to breathe now? Is that what we're talking about?
Essentially, these are functions your body has inspired by the peripheral nervous system, which can either be associated with the sympathetic pathway, which involves activation of the nervous system, like, here's a way to remember it. I am sympathetic towards your almonds being activated. You'll remember that forever now. Or the parasympathetic system, which has a calming effect on your nervous system. Okay. So things like breathing that are automated, except for right now, because I mentioned it, and we're all manually breathing, but don't feel too bad. I had to manually breathe twice, one when I wrote this and one when I said it, so it's totally worth it. Anyhow, the endocrine system, concerning my line of thinking, would be the target of Las Plagas. By rustling the jimmies of specifically the pituitary gland through things like physical pressure, or even by Las Plagas altering the behavior of the gland entirely through gene manipulation, which, as we all know, Las Plagas definitely appears to be able to do, the body would immediately begin having human growth hormone pumped into it, as well as many other hormones. By a signal being sent out by the ultrapituitary gland, this would also signal to the testes of the Garador to increase testosterone production, and this
balls of steel. Oh no.
Would have a twofold effect. First, human growth hormone would obviously increase muscle mass and bone density, as well as triggering a second puberty of sorts within the Garador, making him grow in height by reactivation of the epiphyseal plates, or the growth plates of the long bones. Second, because of the increased growth, this would trigger the body to increase the amount of red blood cells in the body in order to now fuel the new muscle mass that has begun to build up on the frame. This is why bodybuilders, for instance, who do steroids always seem like they're out of breath. Now, there is a hormonal trigger that has been cited, but you also need to realize building muscle that quickly will put a strain on your circulatory system, as your body would rapidly begin building red blood cells in order to deal with this new strain of extra muscle. This would also increase, or at least cause more pressure on the lungs to take in more oxygen, which again, breathlessness. Las Plagas would bank on this as new vascularity would begin to show up as well. With the muscle increasing, the oxygen saturation of the body maintaining, there is really going to be more circulatory blood vessels present, and the body would need to create these new blood vessels to properly saturate the tissue with the oxygen necessary. As a result, because of this growth, the Las Plagas has inspired in the body, it is able to tap into these new blood vessels and glean oxygen from them more effectively than just the normal amount of red blood cells that were in the normal amount of blood vessels. To me, it appears the worse the oxygen saturation in an area, the more aggressive Las Plagas has to be to the alterations of the body. With El Gigante, the reason he is so large is because this area would still not have much oxygen in it even after altering the body through endocrine system manipulation. Instead, it would keep altering until finally the person becomes so large that their system is just completely distorted, and the head is then pushed forward, and even though it was attached to the neck at one point, it now appears to be on the back as enough blood vessels have fueled it, and it grows in size as well, which is why it was a larger Las Plagas, because it is also dealing with growth hormone. With Garador specifically,
and that ties directly into what Las Plagas is at its core, a parasite. It is going to sustain its existence and growth at the cost of the host. I mean, any number of things in nature. Sure, you have symbiotic relationships, right? What is there? In nature, there's a symbiotic relationship between a spider and a frog, right? Something about the spider lets the frog live there, and the frog, I think, like baits prey towards the spider, something like that. Like, there's mutually beneficial relationships. There's symbiotic relationships, but then there's parasitic relationships, and it doesn't have to be a Las Plagas parasite. It can be as simple as there's a specific bird that lays an egg in another bird's nest, and then when that bird hatches, its initial instinct is to actually like push all of the other eggs out of the nest, effectively just being for all intents and purposes a dick, right? It is sustaining its growth in itself at the cost of whatever is hosting it. Nest parasitism, the cuckoo, right? Yeah, thank you. Like it can be just an interaction. In this case, it happens to be a organism we classify as a parasite here, Las Plagas, that is injected, inhaled, etc. It gets into a host and it will just continue its growth. It actually is very fascinating to me that throughout the game, it's only ever one parasite until we get to the Regenerators. It's actually really fascinating for me to consider that, because it could be an oxygen thing. It absolutely could. It could be its potency. It could also be an example of the cuckoo interaction that we were talking about, how like it just pushes everything else out. Maybe multiple parasites try to embed themselves, but one just kind of kicks all the other ones out or kind of starves them of resources, so it becomes the only plaga in that host. Just, it's interesting to think about.
Specifically, this same process was undertaken, which is absolutely fascinating, as Las Plagas only had to alter the body somewhat in order to achieve the oxygen saturation it needed, with new vessels running towards it. So what it appears to me to be is like the parasite is just being a parasite. It inspires changes to the endocrine system alterations to grow the body to properly fuel itself. But again, this has downstream effects on the functionality of the body as well as behavior. Since we were talking about testicles earlier, this can help to explain the behavior. That's right, emotions are stored in the ball. As the pituitary gland would be kicking it into maximum overdrive through Las Plagas manipulation, this in turn would cause testosterone levels to rise dramatically in the Garador. Think of it as like a roid rage, but 10 times as worse, because it's coupled with cerebral damage, specifically to the frontal lobe being the point of interest, which is associated with emotional control. Plus, there is no reason to think that the amygdala, which is where anger and fear come from, is not affected by the same manipulation, causing the Garador to be in a constant state of rage. This is actually quite an issue for those conducting the experiments. Due to the blind rage the Garador would engage in, this would result in it absolutely stacking bodies and just attacking anything around it. This clearly would cause the experiment to be labeled a failure, from the simple fact that while they were on the right track as far as attempting to create a super soldier of sorts who was stronger than normal, it could not be directed towards any particular goal, as it would not listen. As a result, the ones that were created were chained up and had their eyes sewn shut so they wouldn't just actively attack anything near it. However, this was only a temporary solution, as it is unknown how long they were blinded for. The human brain has a tendency to adapt to circumstances involving our senses. By rendering the Garador blind, all it did was make its hearing better. This is noted in blind people all the time, actually, as a natural adaptation to lost senses. With this, the Garador is strong enough to break chains and can hear a field mouse fart a mile away. As a sound sound is made by anyone in the area, it would appear as though, much like how other Las Plagas drive humans to like not attack one another who are already infected, the Garador can differentiate between fully turned and those only recently infected that are still in control of their own bodies, that being Leon. Because of this, they will walk past those who are fully infected, but this does not completely save them. Because the Garador's own smooth brain comes into play, this creates a bit of an issue. With this much testosterone coursing through them, there is still some semblance of humanity in each one of the infected, even if they are like fully infected. They will still control their own bodies during downtime or during times of like extreme emotional unrest they might be able to come to for a minute. When getting near Leon, it will completely spaz out and start swinging around its blades. Again, blinded, so it isn't 100% sure who it's hitting, which typically turns out to be other infected that just get in the way. Eventually, the Las Plagas will regain control of the body and slow it down to attack before once again losing control of the body as the person goes into a fit of rage. There's really only one way to take these things out. Now, two, if you have enough money. Either way, you can possibly just straight up RPG the thing in the face, which defeats it, seeing as it's enough energetic concussive force being distributed through its body or
Oh my god, no. I'm still actually in the middle of my Resident Evil 4 2004, the original one. I'm in the middle of my randomizer run. Good god, dude. That Garrador, though. There was a Garador that replaced El Gigante, the El Gigante encounter, and we mathed it out. It was some obscene level of HP. Like, it was a not okay level of HP to the point that I think multiple rockets, even on the Parasite, would not take it out. But that's like randomizer health pool levels effects. Like that's something different entirely. Something that really wasn't covered, I guess, or maybe I missed the explanation of it, was the Plaga bursting out the back. But I mean, that's kind of a consistent thing. And he did mention in terms of breathing, it could be that maintaining that level of growth and maintaining that body in the size of the body stresses the parasite out in such a way that it requires to be outside, or at least partially outside, to supplement its oxygen intake. It could entirely be
hard into it, at least, to blow it apart, and the Las Plagas is then decimated. The other option is to attempt to take it out with the Las Plagas on its back. With it running forward, again, you have two possibilities. The first one is you get got. If Leon isn't feeling as spry as usual, the Garador will punch its claws through his face, shredding the underside of Leon's brain and his brainstem. So it's pretty much a lights on, lights off scenario, and you wouldn't even feel that. No. You'd just be gone. He will then stab you through the chest, which is kind of insult to injury. And the other option is, if you're really not feeling good, it'll just straight up decapitate you. You may be alive for a few seconds when you're just a head rolling around, but you would be in total shock. They did an experiment with a guillotine to see if somebody could like blink, and he was alive for like, I think it was like 12 to 15 seconds. They say 30 seconds, but we still don't really know. However, that's not how we do it around here, partner. By tricking the Garador, because again, it's not very smart, it's just very angry, you can get it to accidentally get its claws stuck in a wall, completely exposing Las Plagas on its back. The reasoning it's even there in the first place is that it may have in fact needed more oxygen and was actually breaching the skin in order to do so, sort of like what it does with El Gigante.
I just needed to let Roanoke actually explain the thing. Okay. Can I get a Kip W on that? Does that count as a Kip W?
Hitting enough shots, Las Plagas has become so entrenched in the nervous system and the signaling that it's conducting therein, I suppose, it's going to disrupt it significantly enough the heart stops, which also is seemingly affected, which again leads to the end of the Garador. Ultimately, the Garador is an attempt at a super soldier through experimentation with placement of Las Plagas. We also see the same experimentation with like Iron Maidens or Regenerators, but they have several, and even that puts like even more pressure on their circulatory system, which causes them to be able to heal super fast. But with specifically this one, it seems that the further away the Las Plagas is from oxygenated sources, or again, multiple are added, this will have impacts on the size of the body and healing factors. With this person in particular, it made them larger and more aggressive, but due to other factors, this just makes them dangerous, but the cost-benefit analysis of it was that it was far too skewed, causing them to really serve no purpose beyond just your standard cannon fodder. Well, anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then leaving a like would be awesome of you, and subscribing is a great way to stay up to date on when I post, because we are getting near 1 million subs. I'll drop my Twitter, Discord, Patreon, Roanoke Tales link, and merch links in the description if you want to help out the channel. But speaking of patrons, though, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astrophysicist, Death's Dancer. Thank you, my man. I'd also like to thank our scientists, Chad, the enjoyer of scientific explanations of B-grade horror movies, Dakota23, Josh Blanchard, Lucian Dragon, Metric System, The Last Final Girl on the Left, and Trash Pen and Trenchcoat. And the rest of my patrons, I appreciate you guys as well. Your support is awesome, and it's definitely appreciated. So, big thing, I'm going to stop streaming on Roanoke Gaming because it is absolutely killing my channel's ability to reach other things. Like, I always figured this out like every
Yeah.
year, but then I try it again. I'm like, no, surely things will be different this time. I'm kind of the same way with women. Anyways, so Roanoke Games on Twitch and Roanoke Games on YouTube. That's where these streams are going to be from now on. I'm going to leave my channel alone as far as just uploading videos here, not uploading live streams. So anyways, that's going to do for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and I'll see y'all on the next one.
Honestly, like, YouTube streaming has been hit or miss for me. I've absolutely had times where I've tried to stream on YouTube, and it's just been like, oh, unable to find or unable to connect. And I don't have those same issues with Twitch. The other issue that I've run into with YouTube streaming is that, I'll stream something like Pokemon, Destiny, Resident Evil, and I immediately get hit with a demonetization, to which, I appeal, and they're like, hey, yeah, checks out, you're good to go. But, I mean, it's just one of those, I can't risk it. So if you're actually curious on why I don't stream here, YouTube complications, as well as YouTube monetization complications that can affect everything else that I do, and it just makes it a big headache. So that's why I stream over here on Twitch. Honestly, great video by Roanoke Gaming. Absolutely love their content. I don't watch everything that they do. I don't react to everything that they do. Some things interest me, such as Resident Evil, Dead Space, things that are in my wheelhouse, certain other games as well. Like, I'm sure if Roanoke had a video on the Flood, the Grey Mind, etc., right? Flood infestation. Like, I mean, sure, watch that stuff. But movie, pop culture stuff like that, not really in my wheelhouse. But if that's in your wheelhouse, especially every Spooktober, right? Every October, this is the channel for you. So big thank you to Roanoke Gaming for being awesome, making a really cool video, kind of diving into the morphology, physiology of this, and really just making some really stellar content. And I wish them the best. They are over 1 million subscribers now. I want to help in what ways I can. Just, hey, this person exists, kind of getting people over there. And let me know what you guys' thoughts are on the Garador. Let me know what's your... is there something that wasn't discussed, but you've noticed? Let me know in the comment section down below. See you in the next one.